Catherine Stevenson is an associate professor at North Carolina State University. Her research and teaching is around environmental education, including climate change education. Her main interest related to climate change education is how youth-led conversations might provide opportunity for productive dialogue around climate impacts and solutions. Related to this presentation, she also has deep interest in supporting organizations in developing evaluation plans that best match their interests and those of the communities they serve. Thanks so much for being here, Catherine.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really glad to see everyone introducing them in themselves in the chat. Keep it coming because it's really fun for me to see where everyone's from. Again, yeah, I'm Catherine Stevenson. I'm from NC State. I'm coming to you from the unceded territories of the Tuscarora and Catawba tribes in North Carolina. I see everyone is from a whole bunch of places. And I'm here today to talk to you about evaluation, particularly in a climate change context. I'm trying, oh, there we go. Hopefully you can see my slides. Please speak up. This is a new platform for me, so let me know if something's not right. And I guess I also want to start before I dig into the meat of the program of just sort of acknowledging the wide array of collaborators that have contributed to the things that I'm going to talk about today. I've been involved in a couple of projects that have been partnering with communities and other academics and funders to support evaluation, particularly in an environmental education context. Among those are, we did a project called Impact NC, where we were supporting science museums, and that was funded by the Museum of Library Services and partnering with the North Carolina Natural Sciences Museum. I'm also working in partnership with the Pisces Foundation and several wonderful collaborators and NAAE on a project called EEVAL, which centers culturally responsive and equitable evaluation in environmental education contexts. And I drew slides from multiple presentations. I just kind of want to throw that out there. I'm representing a very large group of really smart and committed people. So I'm happy to point you to other resources as we go through. So gosh, yeah, this is so fun to see so many of you from so many different places. All right, I'll focus on this. So here's where we're going. Here's our sort of a roadmap for the next few minutes. I'm going to talk at you from webinar format. We'll try to make this at least interactive through the chat, and then I'm looking forward to the Q&A portion in the beginning or at the end. So first, I imagine many of you have had some version of an eval 101 talk. So we won't spend a ton of time on this, but just to sort of orient you to how I'm thinking about evaluation and developing a few common languages and tools. So when I think about evaluation, this is drawing on the Center for the Advancement of Informal Science Education. Evaluation is a set of approaches and techniques used to make judgments about the effectiveness of a quality of a program and improve its effectiveness. So you're demonstrating impact and you're also using it to improve. And sometimes another one of my colleagues says that evaluation or research is to prove and evaluation is to improve. So that's another way to think about it too. So the things that you might be interested in are what happened in the program. Did the program work the way that you thought it was going to work? And what did people get out of it? And then once you know that, so what do the findings mean? And then now what? What are the recommendations you have to improve your programs? And then also, increasingly, there's more recognition that good evaluation is culturally responsive. So going a little deeper on these questions that we've all heard many times before, when you think about what happened in the program, you might ask from whose perspective. So what do the findings mean? You might ask to whom, because that can give you lots of different answers. And then now what are the recommendations? And you might ask for whom. So this draws on some culturally responsive and equitable evaluation frameworks. Sometimes we call that CRE. And it works to embrace the complexity of lived experiences of both practitioners and participants. So it's an acknowledgement that people are not coming to your programs as empty vessels. They are coming with a diverse array of cultural backgrounds and lived experiences, and that really has a lot of bearing on their experiences in the program and the way that your program might deliver some impacts. So for example, some groups that I've been working with to various degrees are a group in North Carolina called Muddy Sneakers that takes kids outside for science instruction. And that's public school kids from across North Carolina. And if you've been to North Carolina, you might know it's a fairly diverse state in terms of culture and demographics. So that has a lot of implications for how we might deliver that program. Another one that I'm learning more about and really excited to work with is a program called Rocking the Boat in the Bronx. And they take kids out into the Bronx River and kind of teach them how to sail and do boat building and all kinds of things. And it's a very different population than necessarily North Carolina fifth graders. So who comes to your program really, really matters. This type of approach requires you to be aware of your own cultural position and those of others and use methods to match the context and diverse values of people. And it's this type of approach we might view as ethically necessary. It can improve validity, so it makes your evaluation better, and it's theoretically sound. It just sort of makes sense to make sure that your programs are matching your audience, and also your evaluation methods and questions match the community you're trying to serve. So a quick reflection as we're kind of entering this space. I'm just going to pause for a second and invite you to consider your own program and consider these questions. So who's your program audience? How might their unique characteristics or lived experiences impact how they experience your program? Who and what is your evaluation for? So are you primarily evaluating for grant reporting? That is incredibly common and valid. I'm not knocking it. Are you evaluating to improve your program? Are you evaluating to tell your story to your community? What stakeholders do you have in the evaluation process? What do you hope to do with your results? And how can you help ensure all the voices are included and honored, all the stakeholders in your evaluation experience? So those questions are meant to just sort of ground our thinking as we think through sort of some more kind of nuts and bolts and practicalities of evaluation basics, and particularly in climate change contexts, and hopefully applicable to the context you're in. So one of the most important things when we're thinking about evaluation is choosing your outcomes and planning evaluation. And we're going to go through a couple of basics and hopefully give you some really practical tools to think about. So in the chat, I'm really interested to hear, we're all from all over places. I imagine you also represent very, very diverse programs. And we're coming together under an organization that's focused on climate change education. And so I'm imagining many of you have some relevant outcomes to climate change education, but I'm just curious to see if you'd take a moment and just put in the chat, what is one or hopefully the one kind of main outcome you're interested in your programming? How are you hoping to impact participants or communities? Hands-on difference, okay. Thanks, Rachel. How to communicate climate change to general public audiences, developing a connection to the natural world. Thank you for those. Yep, I see some connection to the natural world, a couple of those. Stronger connection to nature and trees. I'm sure this group loves trees. Behavior change, yep. Awareness of the importance of plants. Who couldn't know that plants are important? Empowering young people to create change. That's one that is very aligned with some of the work that I do. Okay, so I think these are like these are the types of outcomes that I was expecting, and please keep them coming as I continue to talk. And a couple of things that I want to point out. One is that a lot of times these are really big ideas. I think many people get into this work, whether it's environmental education or garden education specifically, because we think it's really important. We want to change the world, right? So our goals are big, our ideas are big, and evaluation can help us make sure that our programs are always oriented toward those big goals, but then we're also able to kind of measure incremental steps to get there. Because no matter how much you love your program that's 10 minutes long, likely people aren't going to take that one program and then change their entire life path. But it might make them go to a different program and then go to another program and have another experience that will contribute to really sustained change. And so evaluation can kind of help us break that down a little bit so that we're realistic about what we're measuring. And then if we're doing that, we're able to create programs that really are kind of the best that they can be. These are awesome. I'm excited to read through them. Yep, plants are cool. I agree. So when we're thinking about climate change specific programming, I just wanted to sort of highlight a couple of, or well, it's more than a couple of outcomes that are really common that we see in both programming and also emerging from the literature of things that climate change education kind of can achieve. So knowledge and awareness is a really common one that people want to or are interested in particularly in short-term programming. And that's really appropriate because as I was saying before, the chances that you're going to take a student and single-handedly change their life in one experience is probably not really high. But you might teach them something that sparks an interest that helps them kind of continue on that path. And so things that we might be interested in measuring are just like awareness. Do we know what climate change is? Do we know the connection to plants? Knowledge, misconceptions is a huge one that people seem really interested in understanding. We also might be interested in things like concern, beliefs. We might be interested in hope and self-efficacy. That is increasingly a common one as we deal with things like eco-anxiety, and we worry about teaching kids about climate change. Is this going to be too much for them? Relational outcomes, things like norms or discussions, if people are talking about this or how they're relating to other people talking about climate change, that's increasingly a really impactful one. And then ultimately, people in general are interested in behavioral outcomes, whether those individual ones, like are we interested in making sure that people turn off the lights more or save energy or plant native plants or those kinds of things. Or we might be interested in more social behaviors. Are people interested in joining clubs? Are they interested in doing big cleanup events or things that are in community with others? Or collective behaviors that we can also often think of as trying to change systems so that like do things like change policies so that the whole system is oriented toward a more climate just future. And then something else that is super important, I'd say across the board, but particularly in a climate change context, are things like context and demographics. Because as we know, people think really differently about climate change depending on where they come from. So that might be their level of education, their politics, their worldviews, their ideology. All of those things can kind of come to bear when you're thinking about the impacts of your programs. So as far as how all those things fit together, some of the stuff you probably know just sort of intuitively. And we could spend like a whole semester at least on all of this. I mean, I've spent a lot of my research career on this so far, but just some sort of tidbits of what we're learning. And I'll just, a couple of caveats here. We have so much to learn. Climate change education research is still pretty nascent. It's growing super rapidly, but it's a pretty new field. So we're still learning a ton. Also, I did sort of like a lazy researcher's job of citing all of these things. There are a lot of stuff that's coming out of our lab or people we collaborate with directly. There's a lot more to learn besides just what we do. But some things that we're learning and some of our colleagues are learning are that locally relevant examples really resonate with people to get them engaged in climate change, which is great news for places like botanical gardens, because often you're talking about plants that are in people's backyards. Knowledge alone doesn't typically build behavior, but if you can pair it with things like concern or hope or norms and self-efficacy, it gets us a little bit closer. So the kind of this adage of like, if you just teach people their care and if they care, they behave, that's a little bit of like a simplistic model. But if you're able to kind of pair knowledge with emotional connections to things, that gets us a little closer to behavior. Relational variables like norms or discussion, if you can just get people talking about climate change in community, that sometimes can get people a little closer to collective or social behaviors, which arguably are a lot more impactful when you think about trying to kind of address climate change. Context matters so much in climate change. Where people come from really matters. But for youth, probably less so, which is kind of good news. A lot of our labs work looks at this. So it's things like politics really polarizes people over climate change, and that's less of an issue with kids, particularly when we think about how people learn about climate change. Kids seem to be a little bit more like plastic in their views or flexible, so they're able to kind of learn more stuff without politics sort of getting in the way. Another thing is that discussion really matters. So people talking about climate change really seems to kind of boost engagement, and youth-led discussions seem to matter a lot. So when kids are doing the talking, it seems to invite adults into the conversation in a way that can kind of cross political divides, which I'm just sort of spattering out a few things, and we can get into any of this more in the Q&A if this piques your interest. I will also note that I think there's going to be a handout available if it's not already out there with a PDF of the slides, and all of these things are clickable if you really want to dive deep. I included some academic papers for you. So when you're thinking about all of these outcomes, it can be super overwhelming because I know environmental educators, we all want to just sort of change the world, and we get so excited. We're like, whoa, but what if our program could do this and this and this and this? And sometimes it's really necessary to sort of like take a breath and bring it down a little bit. And here are some things to kind of keep you down to earth and make sure that your evaluation is useful. Because sometimes when you have data and it, like, you design it in a way that your data doesn't make any sense, it's almost worse than not doing an evaluation at all. So designing it in a way that's going to be useful and relevant to you is really important. So we want to make sure that when we're choosing outcomes that they're logical. Does it make sense that the program that you're doing is going to be linked with the thing that you want to measure? It's testable. You're going to be able to measure it with the resources that you have. And it's also relevant. Is anyone going to care about this? Are you going to care about this? Is this mission aligned? Are your participants going to care about this? Is your community going to care about this? Sort of who are the end users of your evaluation? Is this going to matter to them? Which leads us to thinking about a theory of change. I am going to talk about theories of change and logic models, which I know is sometimes not the most exciting, but we'll try to make it good. And the key thing is I want to emphasize how you can use these in your programs, hopefully to just make really, really good programs. I get excited about theories of change and logic models. So a theory of change is really just an if-then statement. So it's like, if your program's working the way it should, then we should expect these outcomes, which will lead to these big changes and these really exciting things we want to see in the world. So when you're able to articulate a theory of change, it can actually be really useful because it can uncover some assumptions that you might be making that maybe you need to examine a little bit more. It reveals some intermediate steps. So sometimes you might say, okay, this program, ultimately we're interested in building a strong connection to nature, but this program may not be doing that, but it might lead to this, which would lead to this, which would lead to this. And it also is a way to link project activities and outcomes. So as an example, Project Budburst, if I imagine many of you are familiar, but this is a citizen science program where people can track phenology over time. And so if we have fifth graders, for instance, maybe you would invite fifth graders to participate in Project Budburst at your site, and then offer teachers a way to kind of follow up with that over the course of a school year. And maybe you'd even follow up with a program afterwards to kind of contextualize the data for them. So we could say, if we engage fifth graders in Project Budburst for a season, it'll strengthen their understanding of how phenology and climate change are connected, which will lead them, which will make them more likely to make observations and connect to climate patterns in the future. All right, so this is a perfectly logical theory of change. This makes sense. It's consistent with the literature. It's pretty testable. Like, it's pretty easy to measure understanding, and it's relevant. Only you can answer that question. Would you care about these answers? And that's a really important thing to ask. And then once you have your theory of change, you can transfer that to a logic model. Logic models can be really helpful in just sort of breaking all of these things down into steps. I know they can be irritating, and most people do them in the context of writing grants, But really, if you're able to do it on the front end and use it as a way to plan your evaluation, they can be super helpful. So here's one example, and maybe I'll convince you. So logic models really go from your theory of change to make it a little bit more granular in how you're considering this. So all the if statements, or if your program's working the way it's meant to. So if you have the resources that you think you need, if you're doing all the stuff you're supposed to be doing, and it's working, people are coming to your programs, you're serving the people you say that you're supposed to, then we should expect these outcomes. So this is how people might change. And then if people change this way, then we should be contributing to these impacts, which are usually more big long-term goals, things like a more climate literate citizenry, or changing climate change policy, or all those things that you probably can't do single-handedly, but you can contribute to. And so using our bud burst example, this might look like, if you were going to fill out a logic model for that, your inputs would be all the resources you have. So you might have the bud burst platform, phonology lessons, trained educators, and a bunch of scheduled field trips. And if you have all of those things, then the things you might be able to do, or you have fifth grade classes coming out to the gardens, the garden educators leading lessons, classes are contributing to the bud burst throughout the semester, and then educators might do a Zoom follow-up or classroom visits to contextualize the data. If you're able to do that, then the things that you should be able to kind of show for it would be, we'll say 500 students attending gardening programming. These are often things that you count up. Maybe 300 data points recorded into bud burst, and then those students receive follow-up lessons. So that would be an example of, like, if all that stuff happens, then we might expect things like increased knowledge of phenology, connection to climate change, increased ability to identify native plants, increased motivation to make observations among students. Students might get into it if we're able to do all of this stuff. And then the impacts we might be contributing to are diverse groups of students equipped with knowledge, skills, and motivations need to make informed decisions of climate change. Okay. All right. So hang with me. So I think the way that logic models get exciting is when you're able to kind of put them to use. So one way that you can use them is developing really effective evaluation questions. So you might go back look at this logic model and saying, okay, knowing of all this, what might people actually want to know? When you look at this, what are you curious about? You're like, ooh, I hope this happens. So one thing you want to know, you just say, what do you want to know about whether this works or not? And answers should be evidence-based and logical, right? So you want to be asking questions that are aligned with your program. So hopefully they kind of come from your logic model. They should make sense and be logical and not be sort of from left field. And again, relevant to your stakeholders. So examples of things you might ask. So if you were interested in inputs, you might ask things like, well, are we fully staffed this year? And what's our continuity plan like? Or what's our continuity like? Do we have seasonal employees? Is it high turnover right now? Because that really might impact the rest of this stuff. You might say, are teachers satisfied with the programming? Are we offering it in a way that's accessible to them? Is it easy for teachers to do the field trips? Because if not, nobody will come and none of the rest of this stuff will happen. Do they plan to follow up with bud bursts on their own? That's your idea. Is it teachers' ideas of what's good for their classes? Those are things that you might want to consider. Do our student participants match the demographics of the county? So if your ultimate goal is that diverse groups of students equipped with knowledge skills, you might want to check, like, who's coming to our programs? Are we representing our target population or not? Outcomes, do students increase knowledge of phonology? Is the change the same across demographics? You can kind of invite people to go a little deeper, saying like, okay, so are we getting these outcomes for everybody across the board? Is it only for some students? Are we kind of preaching to the choir? Those kinds of questions. And then you might look at climate literacy over the next 5 years, or maybe you have one outcome of interest is that teachers are teaching climate change more. Hopefully you're seeing some links between kind of the things that you're able to put out and the questions you can ask. It's hard on these webinars and I can't see your faces, but please ask questions for clarification if things come up for you. One other thing I'll mention on these logic models is that one thing to really bring them to life, I think, and make them incredibly useful is to use them as a staff visioning process. So this is an example of I mentioned Muddy Sneakers. It's an organization I work with a lot here. We did this process with them a few years ago. And essentially what we do is we take the logic model questions, and then we have people kind of collaboratively work on these and fill them out, like their perceptions of the program. And so this was stakeholders like instructors that are the frontline instructors working with kids. It was the teachers that kind of partner with the program. It was school board members. It was the board members of the organization. And we had everyone fill one of these out. And then we looked for commonalities and differences. And it was really fascinating. People's ideas of even like what the program was was very different across the board. Or like, what are the essential elements of the program? Some people had really strong feelings of like, well, it's not a Muddy Sneakers Day if we don't do a silent sit. Or some people are like, I never do that. It's not a Muddy Sneakers Day if we don't do. You get the idea. Also, the outcomes, people were all over the board. They were saying, well, we're doing this for science education. Some people were saying, no, it's connection to nature. This is what's driving me. And we had this long list of outcomes that had varying degree of relationship to their organization's mission. And it was really illuminating to try to understand where people were coming from and why people were invested in the organization, and then try to kind of align people with a sense of shared purpose and understanding. And I found this is like super helpful to do just like for a staff development organization, like full stop. But then also it has been useful in getting buy-in and interest in an evaluation. So if you're able to get people on the same page of like, what are we doing here? And what are we like really excited about knowing more about? Then you can use that to really design your evaluation. And then people want the data because they are like, we need to know that so we can improve our programs. So if that's something that's exciting to you, I have a link on the handout too of just sort of like a sample way to work through one of those workshops. And I can talk more about that too, if that is of interest. So just let me pause for a second. I've been talking a lot. I have a couple more things to share, but I'm just curious, like what's resonating so far? How are you what here feels new? If anything, how are you maybe thinking about your evaluation or your programming differently at this point? I just want to pause for just a moment. I'm realizing that I will acknowledge I edited these slides right before, and this question is like totally grammatically nonsensical, but ideally I'm just wondering what's resonating with you. Yeah, drop-in visitors, that's a really great point. I'll see if I can speak to that. Good. I'm selling people on logic models. That always makes me happy, but you don't have to say that. I've also had people say like, what do we do if we really just hate logic models? I'm like, oh, you're not alone. Okay. All right. These are helpful. And thank you for oh no, I've lost it. This drop-in visitors portion. I think that's a really great question. And thank you for asking it too, because I tend to work with more long-term programs. So I kind of default to those examples. What I think I would say to you is I think that's why evaluation planning and thinking is so important on the front end, right? So when it's drop-in visitors, that logic model is going to look really different, right? So it's like, okay, if we have these really engaging like exhibits, right? Then hopefully people will stand at this exhibit for a minimum of, we'll say 30 seconds. And then maybe then they are motivated to go to this exhibit, or maybe your outcomes are going to be different, right? Maybe they're then motivated to come to a longer facilitated program, or maybe they are motivated to sign up for a membership, or whatever it is. I think that's where kind of the rubber hits the road in evaluation planning, is thinking about, okay, what's our program and what are we trying to get out of this, and what's like feasible. And then hopefully, things like a logic model can be really helpful in helping you kind of like lay out all of those things. And then the evaluation questions become a little bit more manageable once you have it all laid out. Let me just scan through these a little bit more. Okay. All right, and we can talk more about this. Yeah, you're so right. You get stuck in the day-to-day logistic of programming. Maggie, you're not alone. That is so, so common. It is really hard to like carve out the time. Okay, I'm going to just go through a couple more things and then we'll open it up for questions. These are all great questions and I can certainly speak to many of these topics. We're not going to go into how to analyze your data. That's a whole like series of webinars, but just really quick, I just wanted to mention a couple of things, particularly kind of like beyond surveys, because that's what I think a lot of people do. But when you have your evaluation questions, then you also have to figure out your methods. So you have this question, how are you going to measure it? Many of us do surveys, and I think a lot of times for good reason. You often are seeing many, many visitors. We really don't have time to talk to all of them. So surveys are one method, and I can talk a little bit about how you might be able to use those more effectively. Another way to think about these are more qualitative data. So interviews, observations, document analysis. I've seen some good modes for using observations at exhibits. So just kind of like standing back and observing how people are interacting with those exhibits. So that can be sometimes quantitative too, but you might, anyway, we can talk more about that too. And then there's sort of this middle ground of mixed methods where you might do some of both, and sometimes what we call embedded assessments. So those are when we take something inherent about the experience or the program and use that as evaluation data. So for instance, something I've seen at museums and is super common is like maybe you'd have a single question and a couple of buckets, and you get people to put like a chip in different buckets answering the question so that you can visually see sort of like an aggregate the responses. Or you might have a way like of debriefing a program with kids. I've done that a lot, where you like have a couple questions and you just have people raise their hand, like you might even say, all right, give me a 1 to 5 how comfortable you felt with that. And they might, you might just quickly scan and kind of average and just write that down. Those kinds of things can be really useful for evaluation too, where you just sort of build it into the practice of the program. It doesn't even feel like they're giving you information, but they are. Some really good things to think about when you're choosing your method is this going to be able to be reliable and valid? So that's like some like researcher jargon, but essentially just means, are you going to be able to do this consistently? So you have this great idea. Are you going to be able to design it in a way that you're going to be able to get that data kind of semi-consistently? That is not to say that you have to like survey every single person that works through your door or talk to every person or do this with every program, but are you going to be able to do this in a way that's like sustainable, and you're going to be able to do it in the same way almost every time? Is this an accurate way to measure what you're trying to measure? Like, are you actually going to be able to get at your outcome by that? Is this feasible? Do you have enough money? Do you have people that are going to collect this data? Do you have the time to do it and to analyze it? These are all really important questions, because it's a real shame when people do evaluations and then the surveys just sit in the desk. So because that's so much time that participants have put into giving you information, and then it just sits there. And I don't mean that as a dig. I think I have done that so many times, and that is so, so common. And I know many of you are feeling that. And then the other thing is are your methods culturally responsible? Are the tools and collection are not culture free? So are you doing this in a way that's applicable? And not everything is appropriate everywhere. And this could be even, I'll give you one concrete example that can maybe daylight this, and it doesn't have to be that complicated, is in some of our work, in almost all of our work, we try to collect some level of demographics, because we're interested in how our programs might impact different kids differently. And how we ask those demographics varies so much depending on what region we're working in. So there are areas of North Carolina where we wouldn't dream of asking something like, how do you identify, when we're thinking about gender? That's just not going to fly there. So we might ask just like, what is your gender? Some areas it feels very inclusive and a positive thing if we ask, what is your gender? And then offer several different categories, including things like non-binary or transgender. And it really is a method of just like understanding the context that we're in, and really tailoring our methods so that people feel like included and invited by our evaluations rather than sort of like excluded. So I know we could get way into that, but it's just something to really keep in mind. And then when you analyze it, that can be such a beast sometimes, but things to like some questions that can hopefully help it a little bit more manageable is really just focusing on like, what story are we trying to tell here? What patterns are emerging? What outcomes were met and which weren't? What story do we have to tell other people, but also what story do we have to tell ourselves? What kind of improvements we can make? And do we need to collect more data? These are questions to keep in mind as you're analyzing. And then it's also important to remember to communicate your results, hopefully to the participants themselves, or at least the communities you're serving. So things you'd want to consider are, you want to communicate what you did, what the program was, what the evaluation was, what questions you ask, and why it matters, and what you would recommend. And so again, like the idea for evaluation, I think it's helpful sometimes to remember, we're not trying to this isn't a test. It's okay if your program didn't do well. The important thing is to generate useful findings so you can do something with it to continually improve. So that was a lot of talking to no faces. These webinars are a surreal experience, but I'm just going to pause there, and I think we're going to transfer into some Q&A. If you haven't gotten the handout yet, I will offer that you can go to this short link and you can download it there. It's the same thing, and there should be clickable links to other resources. People are always wanting to know how to where to find more information. You can click through there. The slides are clickable. All of that stuff is all there for you. So that's it.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Catherine. That was great. And yeah, everyone in the chat, if you would like to access that handout, Grace gave you some instructions in case it's not evident how to navigate to it. You'll be able to figure it out using those instructions. I'm going to just remove your slides for a second so we can see a little better. And yeah, if people have questions that you want to submit in the chat, I'll be watching there, but I have many questions I can ask you too. So we're looking forward to seeing what people had to say and what resonated. In the chat, I saw a lot. You thought we wouldn't like logic models, or we might be bored by logic models, but there was a lot of love for logic models.
I'm so glad.
And a lot of interest in that idea of participatory logic modeling. And you mentioned that there's a resource on that, but I wondered if you want to talk a little bit more about sort of what that exercise might look like if we wanted to do it with our colleagues.
So essentially, this is like a typical workshop of what I might do with an organization. So we'd kind of it's helpful to pull as many stakeholders as you can together, but it may be more appropriate for you just to do it with your in-house team for more of like strategic visioning. But essentially, like I offered a couple of prompts here that really align with the logic model. So you don't want to like throw a logic model right at them from the beginning, because people are like, ah, but if you just ask these questions, they make a lot of sense. So it's like, I like being part of this program because, and then get them to just list like 3 things at the most. I left a muddy sneakers thing in there, but because of our program, most participants are going to change in these ways. Or if it doesn't happen to all kids, I'm most proud when I see kids change in these ways. I know our program is going to be successful in achieving these impacts because I expect long-term changes because, or these are the things that we have, etc. So you can kind of prompt people with these questions just to get them thinking about them. And then we can like pull out the logic model, right? and point out these prompts actually just go with these categories. And then what I've done before too is just sometimes I'll have people look at this blank logic model and like jot down ideas themselves. And then we get in groups and we kind of compare, and then do some like collaborative consensus building in small groups with Post-it notes. And then I'll put big chart paper, and then we put it up on the chart paper and look at it all together. And then people can do a gallery walk and then talk about like, what do you notice? What was surprising? Like, where do we overlap? What do you think is the most important? And then then it can go a lot of different ways. Before, I've also done an exercise where everyone gets dots to vote. And so one of the questions we might have is like, all right, y'all, we have like 17 outcomes people are excited about. We can't measure all of these. Like, what do you want to measure? And then people might vote for their top 3 or something, and that might just emerge. And then that can also be illuminating. You might step back and be like, well, like here, it was like, we're a science ed organization and nobody wants to measure science outcomes. Like, what does that tell us? Like, do we just need to measure science outcomes because that's what we need to do? Or do we need to like rethink our mission and vision? Like it can bring up some bigger questions for the team too. But if anything, I've found really just that exercise is so helpful to get people to be like, okay, this is why we're doing what we're doing. Because I forget who said it in the chat, but it's so common. I've worked in frontline organizations so like for years, right? Like you were just like, okay, like I don't have time to think about evaluation. I have to like get my materials prepped, and oh shoot, we're out of like Q-tips or whatever I need. I got to run to the store, or like I get it. Like you were strapped. But taking some time away, it helps really orient people to kind of the big why of what you're doing. And then it makes evaluation a little more palatable. You're like, okay, like it really is important that we understand this, so we can make our programs better.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think just having opportunities to talk to each other about evaluation internally in our own organizations is great. I also know that you've done some work on organizations talking to each other about evaluation. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that, how you've seen organizations collaborate with each other, either in evaluating climate change education, or if not that specific, evaluating in the environmental education or museum education world. Because I think like we're a peer learning cohort, maybe there's ways that we as public gardens might be able to work together.
For sure. So I've seen this work a couple different ways. Or actually many different ways, but some of the projects that I mentioned at the beginning are really aimed at what we term collective evaluation. So that's like a close cousin with like collective impact. And so it might be, one of the questions might be like, how might we learn together and support each other through evaluation? How can we kind of like both learn how to do the evaluation and like learn the process together? And also, how might we learn from the product better? Like, how might we learn from our data better and learn across organizations? So that's like one model. Another model might be like, how might we as organizations identify some common outcomes and measure the same thing so that we can say something collectively, not just about like what our programs are doing, but also like what botanical gardens are doing, right? And sometimes that has, in my mind, has like huge potential in terms of like communicating the value of your field, or trying to convince like major funders to be like, you know what, botanical gardens are pretty cool, you should give us more money, or whatever it is. And that collective evaluation, that level is can be difficult, but I think really rewarding. So some models that I've seen work really well are essentially like learning in community, like similar to what you're doing right now, but then also finding space to debrief in community, and try to apply things in your own context and try them out, and then come back together and say like, like that logic model thing made sense on the webinar and I thought it was really cool, but I tried to do it and it was really hard. Or like I tried to do it and I couldn't figure out this part. And then kind of helping each other out. That's a way you can kind of like support each other in learning the how to. But then I think even more powerfully, particularly if you're able to identify some common outcomes. So like I saw a lot of people saying like connection to the natural world, or just like, appreciation for plants, or whatever it is. If you're like, okay, what unites us here? We're all interested in connection to nature and appreciation for plants, whatever it is. Are there some common metrics we might be able to use, some common survey items or a common method, like, like putting smiley faces on a chart or whatever it is. Can we all do the same thing and then be able to kind of roll that up? And that can be useful so that you can both like compare programs. And sometimes, and this requires some like mutual respect and community building, right? Because you don't want it to be competitive, and then because then it's no fun. You don't want to be like, well, their program connects to nature better. That's not what this is about. It's more about like, gosh, you had like, this program had like some pretty awesome gains. Like, tell me more. What were you doing? And then see if it works in your context. Or this program over here, like, probably like they're doing an awesome program, but for some reason, like kids still don't care about plants or whatever it is. You can help each other out, and that can be super powerful too. So anyway, rambling a little bit, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And you mentioned a couple of different methods, and I wanted to ask you a question about methods. A lot of us use surveys. Surveys are quick to disseminate usually, and they give us quantitative and sometimes qualitative data if we're using questionnaires. I wonder if you have thoughts or things that you've seen about cool research methods that work well in contexts like ours that are not surveys.
Yeah. So again, I think there's a lot of promise, I think, in things like embedded assessments. So I'll give you just like a couple of examples of things that have worked well. And again, I'm not in the botanical garden world. So Emily, maybe you can help me if I'm like off base and like, well, we never do that. So like, for instance, I've seen a lot of programs, including in botanical gardens, do like art-based stuff with kids, right? So you might have them draw a picture of a garden or draw a picture of a plant or whatever. So you might be able to figure out a way that activity aligns with the outcomes that you're looking for, and figure out a way to use that to measure. So like, for instance, one of my colleagues did a program on biodiversity, right? And so they were interested, they had kids design like, or draw like their, an ecosystem, right? And so then after the session, they took those drawings and had a rubric that were just scored, like, do we have something that has people in here, like, or biotic, abiotic, like how many species do we see, et cetera. And then they were able to just sort of like a very rudimentary score, the kind of thing that you can kind of glance at it and give it a quick score, because you don't want it to be complicated, because you might have 200 of these things, right? But then they were able to just take this thing that kids were already doing in program, so you don't have to take extra time, and then design a way to score it. Another example was working with a group in California that's interested in increasing access to nature, and they do a lot of beach stuff, and they have kids kind of, sometimes they're like surfing for the first time, and they're having these like amazing experiences, and so they always embed some reflection to try to like reinforce that learning. So they have them do like these blog posts. So we talked to them about thinking critically about their blog post prompts and seeing how they might relate those to their outcomes. So, like if they're interested in like an increased awareness of like the natural resources that are available to them, they would have a prompt that would get at that, right? And then they would be like, in their heads, be like looking for certain things, like, did they remember the places we went? Did they learn about new places, et cetera? And then as they're reading through these prompts, which they would anyway, they kind of have this rubric in mind, and it's just like classroom grading, right? You're just like checking off, like, did they do this? And then that can become your evaluation data, right? Like your like reflections, X out of what, 50% of the kids were able to identify 3 new parks, or whatever it is. You can generate stuff that way.
Yeah, thanks. We had a follow-up question here from Sarah about examples of embedded assessments with adult program attendees. So I think a lot of times with kids, we might be doing like creating more artifact type things that we can look at. We can do that with adults too, but maybe we don't as often. Do you have thoughts on sort of other ways to engage in embedded assessment?
Because I don't work with adults a ton, so and if I do, it's usually in the context of like teacher professional development. So we have them working, like acting like kids anyway, because that's like good professional development stuff. But I would I guess I guess the difference with adults is often we kind of lean on techniques that are maybe not as interactive, but I think that's the key, right? Like if you're able to design um, things that are interactive, I mean, that's just like good pedagogy anyway. So like if you are doing a lecture, maybe like embed some quizzes in there and use those for evaluation, or have them do prompts, right? Like little discussion prompts or something, and have people share out things, but just be cognizant of your questions that you're asking for people to share out, and have a way to say like, okay, like, are they able to identify the things that I want them to identify? Are they able to make the connections that I want them to make? Or if you're having like wrap up discussions, you just like being thoughtful of the questions that you're making and making sure that they're linked to the outcomes. Um, Sarah, I hope that's satisfying. I guess I'd be happy to learn more about your program and maybe we can talk more specifically.
Yeah, and I think you bring up a good point of just giving opportunities for people to share their thinking.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, so if, I mean, we could look at what people have said in the chat, or we could like create opportunities for people to talk to each other and what's the nature of the conversation. So I think we need to remember to do that, to give those opportunities so we can understand what people are getting out of it.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
Sarah,
We're going to go to this next one.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
worldview and politics.
Mhm.
I just get excited about that one because I just think it's an interesting topic. So Sarah, if I understand your question right, one thing I want to point, or like that I want to like clarify, is that like the goal is never, or at least my goal is never to like change people's worldviews or politics. One, I think that's like unrealistic, but I don't think that that's like ethical, right? Like I'm not trying to change people's values. But I think what I meant when I was talking about that is just understanding that what people are bringing to an experience in terms of values has a huge bearing on how they're interpreting the experience, particularly in a climate change context. And as far as like resources or things to think about, maybe just knowing that is a good idea. And then there's been like really wonderful work done by an organization called Noki, and it's linked on your handout. It's the I don't know if I'm going to get the acronym right, but it's ocean interpreter. So it's people working in aquaria, which I know is not exactly your world, but I think the lessons would be super applicable. And they have really wonderful evidence-based techniques for interpreters to talk about climate change in values neutral ways that really invite everyone into the conversation. And they're short ways, like it's interpreters, right? Like it's like roving interpreters at an aquarium. It's not programming. It's like, how do you just engage people? If you're just standing by an exhibit, how do you talk about climate change in a way that is invitational, and recognizing that your visitors are coming from all walks of life?
Thank you. We have one question here about you showed some of those findings around climate change education.
Yeah, so this is like a pretty big theme in the research we do out of our lab. We're interested in kids talking about climate change or really any environmental issues. And our hypothesis around that is that when you have kids leading conversations, that it might activate some universal values for people. So people hold values, like a whole array of values that might be conflicting at times. So you might, for instance, like you may have a pretty individualist worldview that would say like you're in general opposed to regulations because you feel like everyone should be able to make individual choices that are best for them and their families, right? Totally valid, right? But that also can be a conflict with things like climate change policy, right? However, you may also, the same person likely has a value, because most people do, of wanting what's good for children and like future generations. Almost everybody, like we want our children to have a better future. And so what we've kind of found is that when kids are leading conversations, our hypothesis is the mechanism is that it's activating some universal values, and it helps people kind of like lay aside some of the other values that might get in the way of listening to one another for climate change. And it may just sort of like get people to listen to what kids are saying in a little bit more value neutral way. And so that's the worldview piece. And then as far as discussions, another important piece to that is what we're finding is this, and it's not us just finding this, plenty of people are kind of talking about this. And Catherine Hayhoe says this a lot, like the most important thing you can do for climate change is just to talk to people about it. So we think about like spreading like spreading behavior. Like if you think of it as like a disease, like disease vectors, as we have all learned in the last few years, disease can run really fast, right? And it doesn't matter if you know people or not, it just spreads, right? And ideas are like the opposite. If anything, like if you don't know someone very well and they're talking to you about an idea, like you're more likely to be skeptical about it because you're like, who are you? But if it's somebody you trust and you're talking about an idea, you're really likely to be able to like adopt it, right? And so doing things like talking about your passion for climate change or like environmentalism or, you know, behavior change, when you have those discussions, it can be a super powerful tool, even though it seems like really inconsequential. And that's also something we found with kids is that those conversations can be super powerful when kids are having them. And it's something kids can do, and it doesn't have to feel super overwhelming for them. So that's what I have to say about that right now.
Thanks. Yeah, that's helpful. And it's nice to have some of those climate change specific findings because, that's what we're interested in. We are almost at the end of our time here, so I'm going to ask you a final question. You've shared some great resources with us, and thank you so much for those. I wanted to ask for members of our public gardens education community, are there resources or organizations you suggest that we might look to kind of as we continue exploring new practices for evaluating in education programs, specifically related to climate change or possibly bigger than that?
Yeah, I mean, I linked to most of them on that handout. I mean, I know you said that too, but there's a couple projects I would probably send people to, and Noki is really one of them if you're interested in. I think that would be a really applicable one to the botanical garden world. And they have whole trainings and handbooks and lots of stuff. They've been in operation for a while. And I think that would be for like really informal, you know, like visitors that just sort of like rove around. That could be a really important and useful thing. As far as like general evaluation training, I listed some websites and organizations and projects to think through. I am working on a project. I would be remiss if I didn't try to like plug it. We're terming it EEVAL. It's an environmental education context, which I think is applicable to your audiences. But we should be launching some webinar series this spring, and then beyond that have some opportunities for people to engage more deeply and like getting some evaluation, some support, and generating some resources. So that's also linked on the handout. If you're interested in learning more, we can link on that.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll watch for that new stuff coming out too. It's very exciting. Thank you so much, Catherine, for being with us today. And thanks to everyone who attended our program and asked your great questions and shared kind of where you are with the work that you're doing.